Hey guys, tonight we're heading somewhere warm, somewhere ancient, and somewhere with just enough buzz, not from caffeine, but from something far older. You're standing at the edge of the Nile in what is now southern Egypt and northern Sudan. Thousands of years ago, the air already warm even though the sun has just decided to haul itself above the horizon. The river is wide here, glinting gold and bronze, carrying with it the promise of fish, trade, and the occasional crocodile. One that would prefer you didn't stand too close. The banks are alive with voices, the soft scrape of baskets being set down, and the splash of someone wading knee-deep to rinse a clay jar. You probably won't survive this. Not because of anything dramatic, but because the modern stomach is not exactly primed for ancient Nubian beer, which is thick, tangy, and contains, let's call them textural surprises. But that's okay, you're here for the story, not the hangover. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop your location and your local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're stepping onto packed earth, fine dust already coating your sandals. This is a Nubian riverside settlement, somewhere between a bustling hub and a sleepy village. The smell hits you first, not unpleasant, just rich. Mud brick ovens are already alive with heat. Someone is roasting fish nearby, and further down, there's the sweet-sour tang of grain being soaked, the smell drifting like a low note through the morning air. Children dart past with woven baskets, some carrying kindling, others with round loaves that look half-finished, perhaps bound for a brewer's table. The Nile here isn't just a scenic backdrop. It's the spine of the entire process. Grain is grown thanks to its annual floods. Clay for brewing jars comes from its banks, and the water itself, muddy, yes, but life-giving, is the essential heart of the beer. You glance upriver and spot a small wooden skiff ferrying a load of reeds, possibly for new brewing mats or roof repairs. To your left, a line of women balance jars on their heads with an elegance that makes you rethink every time you've awkwardly carried groceries. They pass the central fire pit, exchanging a joke you can't quite catch. Someone laughs loudly. Beer has a way of making its presence felt even before it's poured. Historically, Nubia was a crossroads. Here, Egyptian influence flows in like the Nile itself, meeting African trade routes from the south. Beer, it turns out, was one of those cultural threads that tied everyone together. Archaeologists still debate whether Nubians independently developed their brewing traditions or adapted them from their Egyptian neighbors. Some point to distinct brewing jar shapes and unique flavor additions as evidence that Nubia's beer culture wasn't just a copy. It was its own proud craft. A small procession is moving toward a sunlit patch near the riverbank. You trail behind, careful not to trip on a wayward goat who is very sure this path is his. The group ahead is a mix of farmers and brewers, carrying sacks of freshly harvested emmer wheat and barley. Today's brew starts with this very grain, pulled from the earth only yesterday. The sacks are tied with papyrus cord, and a few kernels spill out as someone shifts their load, scattering across the ground where a hen happily pecks at them. A boy at the rear is humming something under his breath. You can almost catch the rhythm. It's not exactly a song, more of a brewing chant, low and steady, a reminder that what they're carrying isn't just food but potential. Grain here is survival. Turned into bread, it feeds. Turned into beer, it nourishes, refreshes, and, let's be honest, makes long days feel shorter. You catch sight of the fields behind you, a patchwork of green and gold thanks to the Nile's flood cycle. farmers stand knee-deep in the shallows, using wooden scoops to direct water into narrow irrigation channels. The soil here is so rich you could probably drop a modern snack wrapper and it would sprout into something edible, though it might be frowned upon. Somewhere down the river, a hippo bellows. A fisherman mutters something unrepeatable under his breath, though the gist is clearly, "Not again." You notice people keep a respectful distance from the deeper water. Beer brewing may rely on the river, but nobody's in the mood to become part of a crocodile's lunch. As the farmers hand over the grain, you see the brewer inspect a handful, rubbing kernels between his palms, then biting one with practiced indifference. He spits the husk to the ground, nodding slightly. It's a simple gesture, but one that carries weight. Today's beer will be good. Maybe even festival good, which means songs, more laughter, and the possibility of running out before everyone's had their fill. The sacks are stacked in the shade of a low mud brick wall, ready for the next stage. A woman with a sun-creased face and arms strong from years of kneading dough ties a cloth over her hair and gestures for you to follow. You do, weaving past more clay jars and a cluster of curious children who giggle at your sandals like they're some kind of joke. They probably are. She leads you past a corner where someone is scraping residue from the inside of a tall brewing jar. The smell that escapes is warm, earthy, and faintly fruity, proof of last week's fermentation. You get the sense that every jar has its own personality, maybe even its own mood swings. Somewhere behind you, the brewer calls out in a tone that says, "Time to get moving." You realize you've arrived just as the real work begins. The sorting, the measuring, the endless movement between grain, water, and clay. The river hums in the background, steady and patient, knowing it will be called upon again and again today. And as you stand there, half in sun, half in shade, you feel the rhythm of this place start to seep in. The measured pace, the muted chatter, the unhurried certainty that brewing is both an art and a daily necessity. There's no rush, beer takes the time it takes. You're just here to walk alongside it, one jar at a time. You're still standing near that stack of grain sacks, their woven fibers prickly under your fingertips, when the brewer waves you toward the fields. The sun's climbing higher now, taking on that sharp, white edge that says, "Hope you brought a wide-brimmed hat." Even though you didn't, the farmers who've stayed behind lead you along the edge of the tilled plots, your sandals sinking into damp soil where the irrigation channels have recently been topped up from the Nile. It's harvest time for emmer and barley, the twin staples of Nubian beer. The stalks sway in a slow, dusty shimmer, and the air is rich with the smell of grain that's been warming under the sun for weeks. You kneel beside a farmer as he shows you how to grip the stalks low, just above the roots, and slice cleanly with a copper sickle. The sound is satisfying, a crisp snip, like cutting paper, but with a faint rustle underneath. Each bundle gets tied neatly with papyrus cord, as if the grain might misbehave and wander off if left loose. Mainstream history books will tell you the Nubians grew barley for beer and bread alike, but here you see the subtle difference. The barley destined for beer has a particular heft to it, a dryness that promises a stronger malt. The emmer, on the other hand, carries a sweeter aroma even before it's milled, lending body and a touch of richness to the final drink. As you follow the farmers deeper into the field, someone hands you a few loose kernels to taste. You bite down and are surprised. They're chewy, faintly nutty, and release a little burst of sweetness if you give them time. One man chuckles at your expression, the kind of laugh that says, "First time, huh?" On the far edge of the field, there's a small shrine, just a few stones stacked under a fig tree, with a clay bowl placed at its base. A couple of stalks from the very first sheaf harvested rest in the bowl. This is a little-known detail you don't see in many tourist brochures. Some Nubian communities made small offerings to local spirits or deities before the main harvest began, hoping for a smooth season and a brew that wouldn't turn sour. Historians still argue whether these practices were purely symbolic, or if people genuinely believed the grain had to be spiritually approved before brewing. You're invited to help load the grain into baskets. These are wide, flat-bottomed, and light enough that a practiced carrier can stack two on their head at once. You, of course, struggle with just one, your balance wobbles, and a few loose heads of barley tumble into the dust. A child darts over, scoops them up, and hands them back with a mock-serious look, like you've just been caught committing grand theft agriculture. The procession back to the village is slow and steady. You notice how the fields taper into sandy patches dotted with acacia trees, where goats lounge in the shade, flicking their ears at invisible flies. One goat eyes the grain baskets with a longing that's both hilarious and mildly threatening. You pick up the pace. As you re-enter the settlement, you pass a group of women pounding smaller batches of grain in tall wooden mortars. The rhythmic thump-thump carries through the air like a heartbeat. You catch snippets of their conversation, something about a neighbor's cooking pot cracking, something else about a cousin's upcoming wedding feast. Brewing days, you realize, are social days. News spreads here as easily as yeast. You're waved over to a shaded courtyard where the sacks from earlier are being opened. The farmers spread the grain on large reed mats to inspect it again, picking out small stones, bits of chaff, and the occasional hitchhiking beetle. It's all done by hand, the pace unhurried but exacting. They hum while they work, and one older man occasionally tosses a kernel into the air and catches it in his mouth, just to prove he can. A quirky fact emerges as you watch. The Nubians sometimes mix grains from different harvests, not only for flavor but as a sort of insurance policy. If one season's grain had been stored a little too long and risked going stale, a fresher harvest could liven it up. Historians debate whether this was a deliberate brewing technique or just a practical response to unpredictable floods and dry spells. Once the grain has been sorted, it's poured into wide, low baskets for transport to the grinding area. You help lift one and are immediately reminded that grain is heavier than it looks. The brewer smirks at your awkward shuffle, then takes the basket from you and carries it the rest of the way as if it were a bag of feathers. By now, the sun is high enough that shadows are shrinking, and the air hums with heat. A distant bleat of a camel punctuates the moment, and somewhere nearby, someone begins playing a slow, looping melody on a small reed flute. It's the kind of tune that makes time feel stretchy, like the day could go on forever without anyone noticing. In the center of the courtyard, the brewer crouches beside the grain and runs his fingers through it one more time. He closes his eyes briefly, maybe imagining the taste, maybe calculating the proportions for today's brew. Then, with a short nod, he signals that it's ready to move on to the next step. You glance back toward the fields. The stalks still sway in the distance, golden and soft under the relentless sun, and you realize that the journey from soil to sip is more than just work. It's a kind of quiet ceremony, repeated year after year, each harvest feeding into the next batch, each batch into the rhythm of village life. The grain is waiting, and so are the women seated at the low stone querns, broad, flat slabs worn smooth from decades of use. You follow the brewer into the grinding area, a shaded courtyard where the air is cooler and smells faintly of crushed grass and warm stone. The hum of conversation greets you before the dust does. A dozen or so women sit in pairs, each with a handstone they push back and forth across the quern's surface in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. The sound is strangely calming. A soft scrape, 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 punctuated every now and then by a short laugh or the shuffle of shifting knees on woven mats. You kneel down beside one woman who gestures for you to try. She shows you how to grip the stone with both hands, fingers curled along its edges, and use your body weight to roll it forward and back. The grain crunches under the pressure, the kernels fracturing into smaller, paler pieces. Mainstream history will tell you this was hard work, and it is, but what you don't get from a textbook is how communal it feels. The pace of grinding isn't just about efficiency, it's about conversation. News, jokes, family updates, and the occasional not-so-subtle matchmaking suggestion all pass through the air here, woven between the rhythmic scrapes. After your first few tries, your arms begin to protest. The woman beside you grins and makes a small flexing gesture, as if to say, "It's a workout, isn't it?" You give her a theatrical grimace that gets a laugh from the group. A little boy wanders in, leans against his mother's knee, and promptly falls asleep to the soft, repetitive sound, proving that ancient Nubian grinding stones might have been the original white noise machine. Some of the grain is reduced to a coarse meal, meant for bread and beer mash alike. Other batches are cracked more gently, leaving larger fragments of malt that will be soaked and sprouted later. You notice that each pair of women seems to have their own unspoken rhythm, some moving faster, others slower, as if each corn has its own tempo. A quirky detail emerges from the brewer's assistant, who sits nearby sifting ground grain through a shallow reed tray. He tells you that some brewers believed the first few handfuls from a grinding session should be set aside for the household gods. Whether this was superstition, respect for tradition, or just a clever way to sneak a snack, historians still argue over. He winks and admits that, either way, it keeps the gods, and perhaps the brewer, happy. You take a break and wander to the edge of the courtyard, where the sun splashes across a low wall. Two young girls are pounding roasted barley in smaller mortars, creating a fine, almost smoky flour. The roasted grain releases a deep, nutty scent, hinting at the richness it will lend to the beer's flavor. One girl offers you a taste. It's warm, slightly sweet, and just bitter enough to make you imagine how it will mellow once fermented. Back at the querns, the ground grain is being poured into large, shallow baskets lined with linen. The brewer inspects the texture by letting it run through his fingers like sand. Satisfied, he motions for the baskets to be carried toward the malting pits. You notice how the linen catches the fine dust but lets the grain breathe. A small but important detail in keeping it from spoiling before it's wetted. You shoulder one end of a basket alongside a young man who walks with the effortless balance of someone who's done this 1,000 times. As you pass through the narrow lanes of the settlement, you catch glimpses of daily life. A potter shaping a wide-mouthed jar on a low turntable, a child trying and failing to chase a chicken, a pair of old men playing a board game etched into the ground. At one point, you pause to let a caravan of donkeys pass. They're laden with bundles of dried reeds and leather sacks, probably bound for the river docks. The smell of the animals mixes with the ever-present aroma of grain dust clinging to your skin. You're beginning to feel like a walking loaf of bread. Finally, you reach the edge of a long, low structure where the air is thick with the smell of earth and damp stone. Here, the malting pits wait, a row of shallow depressions lined with clay and shaded by woven reed mats. The brewer sets down his basket and gestures for the grain to be divided evenly among the pits. Soon, water from the Nile will be poured over it, coaxing the kernels to sprout just enough to unlock their hidden sugars. You glance back at the querns, now in the distance, their rhythmic scrape fading into the background. It's funny. You came here to learn about beer, but you're starting to realize that every step is its own little world. Its own smells, sounds, and shared moments. Grinding day might not look glamorous, but it's the pulse of the whole operation. The quiet heartbeat before the brewing magic really begins. You're crouching beside one of the shallow clay-lined pits now, the ground beneath you still cool from the night. The brewer stands over the baskets of freshly ground grain, his hand tracing a slow circle in the air as he explains what's about to happen. Not with words you can fully follow, but with gestures that make it clear. The grain's about to take a bath. Two young men arrive from the river, carrying leather skins bulging with water. They pour the water into wide clay jars, then tip the jars into the pits. The earth darkens instantly, and a faint, mineral scent rises up, mixing with the dusty aroma of the grain. You can feel the temperature difference as the damp air brushes your face. This is the malting stage, when grain is wetted to awaken its inner chemistry. In the stillness, you can hear the quiet patter of water soaking in, and somewhere in the pit, a lone kernel bobs to the surface like it's testing the water before committing. Mainstream history says malting is just about unlocking sugars, but standing here, you see it's also a kind of coaxing. The grain has to be persuaded into life again, and there's a delicate balance. Too little water and nothing happens. Too much and you've made swamp porridge. The brewer leans down and spreads the grain with his hands, ensuring an even layer. He moves with the precision of someone who's done this every season for decades. Then he nods to the women waiting with woven reed mats. They lower the mats over the pits, shading the grain from the harshest sun while still allowing air to circulate. A quirky fact slips in from the brewer's niece, who has been following you around like a curious shadow. She says some families sprinkle just a pinch of Nile silt into the malting pits, claiming it makes the grain remember where it grew. Historians still argue whether this has any effect at all or if it's simply poetic. You're inclined to believe it's mostly poetry, but then again, beer is half science, half charm. You take a seat on the low wall that runs alongside the pits. The ground hums faintly under your fingertips, not from any real sound but from the sense of activity below. Sprouting is slow business. You won't see much change in an hour, maybe not even in a day, but the brewer will come back repeatedly to check, turning the grain with a carved wooden paddle so no part overheats or goes too dry. A small group gathers nearby to debate the timing. One man insists 2 days of sprouting is perfect for a strong beer, while another argues for 3, claiming it deepens the flavor. You catch phrases like, "the gods don't wait," and "tell that to my uncle's last batch," which suggests that beer-related arguments haven't changed much in a few thousand years. While you're listening, a sudden bleating from the next courtyard draws your attention. A goat, possibly the same one that eyed the grain earlier, has managed to stick its head through the reed fence, clearly trying to get a taste. The brewer's niece shoos it away with a wave of her arms, muttering something that sounds like an all-purpose scolding used for both children and livestock. You can't help but laugh, which earns you a conspiratorial grin. The air here is a blend of cool earth and sun-warmed straw. Every so often, a breeze from the Nile slips in, carrying with it the scent of waterweed and the distant sweetness of flowering shrubs along the bank. You realize this stage of brewing is less about action and more about patience, an unhurried waiting that fits neatly into the village's daily rhythm. As the sun inches higher, the brewer checks one of the earlier pits from yesterday's batch. He pulls back the mat to reveal tiny white rootlets pushing out from the kernels, the grain transformed into something new. You pick one up. It's slightly soft, cool against your skin, and when you bite it, There's a grassy sweetness that hints at the beer to come. Once satisfied with today's setup, the brewer instructs his helpers to cover all the pits again. You watch as they weigh down the reed mats with small stones, just enough to keep them from blowing away but not enough to block the air. The process is almost ritualistic, each movement deliberate, unhurried, as though the grain might notice if someone rushed. The brewer catches your eye and gestures toward a shaded corner where a jar of yesterday's sprouted grain waits. It's spread out on a wide mat, sun-dried and ready for the next phase. You'll be part of that soon enough, but for now, the malting pits are left in their quiet labor, turning plain grain into the foundation of something worth gathering for. You step back into the sunlight, blinking against the glare. The hum of village life wraps around you again. Somewhere, a baby cries. Somewhere else, laughter bursts out over a shared joke. The Nile keeps moving, slow and steady, as if it's been brewing its own secret concoction for millennia. And here you are, just one more set of hands in a process as old as the river itself. The brewer leads you toward an open stretch of hard-packed earth on the far side of the courtyard. It's bright here, no shade except what you can steal from a passing cloud, and your eyes squint against the light bouncing off the pale sand. You can feel the sun heating your shoulders, the kind of heat that makes you imagine what bread feels like in an oven. On the ground, woven reed mats are spread out in neat rows. They're anchored with small stones at the corners, ready to cradle the sprouted malt from the malting pits. The grain arrives in large baskets carried by 2 people at a time, the kernels cool and faintly damp from their shaded rest. You crouch down beside a basket and scoop up a handful. The little rootlets curl between your fingers, and a faintly sweet, grassy smell drifts up. The brewer gestures for you to help spread the grain into a thin layer on the mats. It's a gentle process, you don't want to crush the sprouts. As you work, a goat wanders suspiciously close, clearly planning a snack raid. A young boy assigned as goat guard waves his arms in dramatic fashion, chasing it off while muttering what you can only assume is goat-specific profanity. Mainstream historical accounts will tell you the drying step was simply functional, to halt germination and prepare the grain for storage or mashing. But here you see the social side. People gossiping as they work, trading news from upstream villages, and even singing low, winding tunes that seem to follow the pace of the sun. A quirky tidbit comes from an older woman seated near the edge of the mats. She says her grandmother always insisted on turning the grain exactly 3 times during drying. Once before the sun reached its peak, once when it was overhead, and once after it started to descend. Historians still argue whether this was truly necessary for quality or if it was just another example of ritual creeping into craft. You're beginning to suspect that in Nubian brewing, ritual and craft are almost the same thing. The work is steady but not urgent. Every so often, someone takes a break, sitting on the low wall to sip from a water jar or nibble on flatbread. The Nile's breeze occasionally rolls through, bringing relief and also helping wick away the moisture from the grain. You're instructed to watch for any clumps forming. Those could trap dampness and invite mold, a brewer's quiet enemy. Nearby, a group of children has made a game of tossing stray kernels into the air and trying to catch them in their mouths. They're not very good at it, but the laughter is contagious. A girl offers you a try, and, perhaps to your own surprise, you manage to catch one. It tastes faintly sweet with a whisper of green, and you get a small cheer for your efforts. As the day leans toward afternoon, the grain begins to change. The sprouts feel drier to the touch, and their scent shifts from grassy to something richer, more like warm cereal than fresh-cut hay. The brewer runs his palm over the surface, nodding in approval, and instructs the helpers to begin gathering it up. The mats are shaken lightly to free any loose husks, then rolled for reuse. The dried malt is poured into wide, shallow baskets for transport to the mashing area. You can hear the soft rustle as the kernels slide against each other, a sound not unlike the shuffle of small pebbles on a beach. There's something oddly satisfying about it. Perhaps because it means the grain has passed another milestone on its way to becoming beer. Before you leave, the brewer's niece appears again, holding a sprout in one hand and a tiny clay whistle in the other. She tells you, through a mix of gestures and words, that her uncle can tell the quality of the malt just by the sound it makes when tossed into a clay pot. She drops one in, plink, and he grins, satisfied. Whether this is skill or showmanship, you can't say, but it's charming nonetheless. The baskets are lifted onto shoulders, and you join the slow procession back toward the mashing vats. The village lanes seem a little quieter now, the midday heat having driven many indoors. Somewhere, you catch the muffled rhythm of someone pounding grain for bread, and in the distance, the low, contented murmur of cattle resting in the shade. The sun-drying step may seem simple, but standing here, you realize it's one of the most exposed, vulnerable moments in the brewing process. Too much wind, and you risk scattering your hard work. Too little breeze, and moisture lingers. And then, of course, there's the ever-present threat of goats. Somehow, the Nubians have balanced all of this into a steady, reliable routine, one that has kept their beer flowing for centuries. You follow the baskets of dried malt into a wide courtyard where several massive clay vats sit in a shallow trench, half buried for stability. Each one is broad enough for you to imagine bathing in, though you suspect the brewer would not be thrilled with that particular experiment. The air here smells different from the drying yard, deeper, warmer, with a faint tang that hints at past batches. Helpers pour the dried sprouted grain into the vats. It makes a soft rushing sound, a dry whisper that dies away quickly. The brewer gestures toward a smaller jar, and from it, warm river water is ladled in, steam rising faintly in the cooler morning air. You watch as the liquid hits the grain and soaks in, darkening it to a richer brown. The scent changes almost immediately, earthy malt blooming into something rounder, more inviting. You're handed a long wooden paddle with a flat, oval-shaped blade. The brewer demonstrates the motion. Slow, steady arcs, scooping from the bottom and folding the grain over itself, then letting it sink again. It's more like coaxing than stirring. The idea, he signals, is to keep the temperature even throughout the vat. Too hot, and you risk cooking the grain in a way that kills the enzymes needed for fermentation. Too cool, and the conversion from starch to sugar will be sluggish. Mainstream brewing history notes that ancient Nubians didn't boil their beer like modern brewers often do, but instead worked in this gentler, warm water mash. Here, you can see why it's not just about chemistry, it's about managing resources. Firewood is precious, and there's no need to waste it when the sun and the river can do most of the work. A quirky tidbit surfaces when one of the helpers, an older man with a sun-browned face, leans toward you and points to a small bundle of papyrus stalks sitting beside the vat. He says with a sly grin that some brewers put papyrus in the mash, not for flavor but to help filter the grain solids later. Historians still argue whether this was widely practiced or just a local trick passed down in certain families. You glance at the bundle again and decide it's the ancient equivalent of having a secret ingredient you casually don't mention to guests. As you stir, the malt and water begin to merge into a thick porridge-like mixture. Bubbles rise slowly here and there, not from fermentation yet, but from the way the mash traps and releases air. The texture under the paddle is surprisingly alive, soft, but with enough body to resist just slightly as you move through it. Every so often, the brewer dips a carved wooden spoon into the mash and lets a little trickle onto his palm. He rubs it between his fingers, sniffs, and then nods or frowns, giving small instructions to adjust the water or stir faster. He doesn't need a thermometer. He's reading it by feel, sight, and scent, a set of skills honed over years. You pause to wipe your brow and notice that the courtyard has filled with a faint haze of steam, carrying a smell that makes you think of breakfast porridge crossed with freshly baked bread. A dog wanders in, nose twitching, but is quickly shooed away before he decides to conduct his own taste test. The process is not silent. While you work, people chat across the vats. Someone tells a joke that earns a round of laughter, and another person hums a slow, repetitive tune that seems to set the rhythm for everyone's paddling. It's not hard to imagine that these mashing sessions are as much about community as they are about brewing. Eventually, the brewer signals that the mash is ready. He dips a shallow reed basket into the mixture and lifts it, letting the liquid pour back into the vat while the solids stay behind. This, he explains through gestures, is the sweet wort, the base liquid that will soon be fermented into beer. You take a small sip from the edge of the basket. It's warm, malty, and surprisingly sweet, with a faint grassy undertone from the sprouted grain. Before the mash can cool too much, it's ladled into large fermentation jars. These stand ready along the wall, their interiors already smelling faintly fruity from previous batches. Some of the wort will carry over a bit of the mash solids, adding body to the finished beer. The rest is strained more cleanly, likely destined for a lighter drink. As the last of the liquid is poured out, the mash bed in the vat looks strangely sculptural. Ripples and channels left by your paddle, slowly collapsing as the remaining moisture drains away. Someone will later feed this spent grain to livestock, ensuring nothing from the process goes to waste. The brewer claps you on the shoulder with a satisfied nod. The hard stirring work is done for now, and the real magic, the invisible work of yeast, will soon take over. But before that happens, you'll be adding something special to give this batch its own signature. And judging by the baskets waiting in the shade, that step might just be the most fragrant of all. You move toward the shaded baskets, each one lined with woven reeds to keep the contents airy and dry. The first basket you peer into holds small clusters of dried dates, their skins wrinkled into deep mahogany folds. They smell rich and sticky sweet, the kind of aroma that makes you think of sun-baked orchards and warm sand underfoot. The brewer motions toward them with a small smile, as if to say, yes, these are going in. You pick up a date and press it between your fingers. It yields softly, releasing a syrupy scent that clings to your hands. Mainstream brewing historians note that in the Nile Valley, dates were more than a snack. They were a natural sweetener, an easy way to add fermentable sugars to beer and give it a richer mouthfeel. And here you can see why. These little fruits are practically sugar bombs wrapped in a paper-thin skin. The next basket holds something more unexpected. Sprigs of wild herbs, their leaves gray-green and dusted with fine sand. You rub one between your fingers and get a scent that's somewhere between mint and sage, but more resinous. The brewer says its name in a word you can't quite catch, then makes a small stirring gesture toward the fermentation jars. This will go in with the wort, lending a subtle, earthy bitterness that balances the sweetness of the malt and dates. A quirky tidbit comes from the older helper, the same one who showed you the papyrus earlier. He leans close and confides, almost conspiratorially, that some brewers in other villages drop in a sliver of acacia bark for flavor and to keep the stomach calm. Historians still argue whether such additions had real medicinal effects, or whether they were simply part of a brewing tradition with a placebo-like comfort. Either way, you imagine that drinking beer with a faint hint of tree bark would be an acquired taste, one you'd probably brag about if you survived it. You help crush the dates into a paste using a heavy stone pestle and a low, broad mortar. The work is oddly satisfying. The dates mash down quickly into a glossy brown mass that smells like someone just baked a cake inside a tent. The herbs are handled more gently, chopped with a curved copper knife into fine shreds. Each ingredient is kept in its own basket until the brewer gives the signal. At last, you approach the fermentation jars. The wort inside them is still warm, the surface shimmering faintly in the dim light. The brewer first sprinkles in the herbs, stirring them gently into the liquid. You watch the fine green strands swirl like tiny river plants caught in a current. Then comes the date paste, dropped in spoonfuls, each one dissolving slowly into cloudy ribbons. The smell changes immediately, deepening into a blend of malt, fruit, and something faintly floral from the herbs. This is the moment where time will do most of the work. The yeast, wild strains that live in the air, in the clay walls of the jars, even on the skins of the dates, will soon wake up and begin feeding on the sugars. There's no packet of dry yeast here, no laboratory culture. Just the same microscopic companions that have been working with Nubian brewers for countless generations. You run your fingers lightly over the rim of one jar. The clay feels warm, almost alive, as if it's already holding some faint, secret vibration. The brewer covers the opening with a mat of woven reeds, tied down with a length of palm fiber rope. This keeps dust and insects out, but still allows the yeast to breathe. Around you, the courtyard has settled into a slower rhythm. The hard work of mashing is over, and now it's mostly about waiting. Someone sits down cross-legged and begins plucking at a lyre, the notes drifting lazily into the warm air. A child wanders over to sniff the jars and is gently steered away before they get any bright ideas about sampling. You catch a glimpse of the Nile through a gap in the courtyard wall, glittering in the sun, sluggish and broad. The same river that gave water for the mash, that grew the dates and herbs in its fertile floodplain, is now carrying on as if your tiny brewing world here doesn't even exist. It's a humbling thought, one that makes the beer-making process feel both intimate and part of something much bigger. The brewer pats the side of a jar and grins, as if to say, "Now we wait." Waiting, it turns out, is an art here. There's no rushing the yeast, no checking with a clock. You go by smell, by the feel of the clay under your fingertips, by the faint fizzing sound you might hear if you lean close on a still afternoon. You wonder how long it will take before the beer is ready to drink. The brewer gives a shrug. 2 days, maybe 3. It depends on the weather, the mood of the yeast, and perhaps a bit on luck. You realize you're in the middle of a living conversation between human, grain, fruit, herbs, and invisible microbes, one that's been going on for centuries. And just as you're about to wander off to watch the river, someone pulls you back toward the vats. They've saved the best task for later today, tasting yesterday's batch to see how it turned out. The brewer leads you to a row of towering clay vessels, each big enough to hide a small child inside, though you wouldn't recommend it, unless someone really wants to smell like bread gone slightly rogue. These are the fermentation jars, the silent hearts of the brewing process. Their outsides are sun-baked to a reddish brown, patched in places with newer clay where a crack once threatened to leak the precious brew. You crouch beside one jar as the brewer unties the rope around its reed mat lid. When the cover is lifted, you're met with a warm, heady scent, sweet from the malt and dates, sharp from the herbs, and tinged with something tangy that makes you think, yep, the yeast is throwing a party in here. A faint fizz pops on the surface, like tiny whispers of air breaking free. Mainstream historians agree that in Nubia, fermentation jars like these were both practical and symbolic. Practical, because the thick clay insulated the contents from the harsh temperature swings between day and night. Symbolic, because they were often decorated with patterns or even carved motifs thought to bless the beer or protect it from spoilage. You notice a series of geometric lines etched into the shoulder of one jar, and wonder if this is a brewer's mark or something more ritualistic. The brewer dips a long-handled ladle into the cloudy liquid, stirring slowly. A little foam swirls up, releasing a more intense aroma. Quirky brewing lore from the region claims that if the foam formed a ring around the edge, it meant the gods were pleased, and the beer would make you dance like the ibis. You glance at the surface. It's trying for a ring, but not quite there. Maybe a half dance, then. Once stirred, the jars need to be sealed again. But this time, the brewer uses a different layer, mud mixed with chopped straw, spread carefully over a linen cloth that covers the opening. You help smooth it down, feeling the grit under your palms. This double-layer seal keeps things clean and discourages curious insects, but still allows a little airflow for the yeast to thrive. As you work, the older helper explains that sometimes, instead of reeds or linen, brewers use thin leather strips to cover jars. Historians still argue whether these alternate methods affected the fermentation speed or flavor. Some say the tighter seal slowed things down, making a smoother beer. Others think it simply kept out more dust in windy seasons. The courtyard smells like a blend of earth and bread and sunshine. The jars stand in a neat line along one wall, angled so their shadows fall across their bases for most of the day. You notice that some jars are slightly tipped, resting on small clay wedges, apparently to encourage sediment to settle in one corner, making it easier to draw off clearer beer later. From the far corner, someone brings a jug of river water to splash gently over the outside of the jars. This helps keep them cool in the midday heat. The water trickles down in slow rivulets, darkening the clay before evaporating. You run your hand across one after it's been cooled. It's pleasantly damp and cool to the touch, as though the jar itself sighed with relief. It's quiet work, but there's an unspoken anticipation humming through the courtyard. The yeast is alive now, multiplying and breaking down sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide. It's the same transformation that's been part of Nubian life for thousands of years, and you're sitting in the middle of it like a time traveler who lucked into the best dinner party prep in history. A goat wanders too close to one of the jars, sniffing suspiciously at the mud seal. Someone chases it away with a splash of water, muttering something that sounds like a warning against four-legged thieves. The brewer chuckles and goes back to smoothing another lid. You're invited to tap one of the older jars, the batch from last week, to check how it's progressing. A small clay plug is popped from its side, and a cloudy trickle streams into a cup. You taste it, tangy, slightly sweet, with a soft herbal edge. It's not fully matured, but already pleasant. The kind of drink that makes you imagine sitting on the riverbank with friends, watching the sun sink over the water. The brewer nods approvingly, then seals the plug back in place. Patience, you remind yourself. The batch you helped flavor yesterday will need a little more time before it can be sampled, and rushing it would just make for a less satisfying drink. You lean back against the wall, looking at the rows of jars and feeling the warm, slow heartbeat of the village around you. Somewhere outside, the Nile is flowing endlessly past, carrying silt and life to everyone who depends on it, including the yeast that now works silently in these clay giants. And as the shadows grow longer, the brewer tells you tomorrow will be even better. You'll get to take the jars down to the riverbank to cool them properly, and that means another excuse to spend a lazy day by the water. Morning in the village begins with that faint, amber light stretching over the Nile, brushing the tops of palm trees and making the river glitter like it's been sprinkled with ground gold. You're already awake, partly because the cockerels decided to have a shouting contest before dawn, and partly because you've been promised a river day. Not the lazy kind where you just sit and splash your feet. Today's trip is all about giving the beer jars a proper cooling session in the Nile's embrace. The brewer arrives, balancing a wide-brimmed woven hat on his head, clearly ready for the sun's persistence later. He waves you over to the courtyard where yesterday's sealed jars are lined up like sleepy giants waiting for their morning walk. Two helpers loop thick rope harnesses around each jar's middle, patting them with plaited reeds so the rough rope doesn't scrape the clay. It's a gentle process. You can tell from the way the brewer's hands linger on each jar's surface that these are more than just vessels. They're almost like family members who need careful handling. You get assigned the easiest job, carrying a smaller jar down to the river. Even so, the weight shifts awkwardly against your hip, and you realize very quickly that beer making is not for the faint-shouldered. The path to the Nile is worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, edged with tamarisk bushes and the occasional startled heron that flaps away indignantly. Once you reach the riverbank, the cooling ritual begins. The big jars are eased into shallow water so that the lower half is submerged. The Nile's current laps gently against the clay, drawing out the heat and slowing fermentation just enough to keep flavors from tipping into sourness. The brewer leans down and scoops up a handful of river water, letting it drizzle over the top to balance the temperature gradient. Mainstream archaeology agrees this cooling method was common along the Nile, not just in Nubia but also upstream and downstream in Egypt. It was nature's refrigeration, powered entirely by the river's constant flow. But there's a quirkier theory floating around, quite literally, that sometimes crocodiles, curious about the scent of fermenting grain, would approach the jars. Villagers supposedly scattered bunches of pungent river mint nearby as a deterrent. Whether that actually worked is debatable. Historians still argue whether crocodiles cared about the smell of mint or just enjoyed surprising humans for sport. You settle onto a flat rock, feet dangling in the water, and watch as sunlight bounces off the ripples, splashing a golden shimmer onto the undersides of the jars. The brewer sits nearby, unhurried, whittling a small wooden scoop while occasionally checking the temperature of the clay with his palm. There's a meditative quality to this, no timers, no frantic stirring, just patient observation, the kind that comes from generations who trust the rhythm of the river. A group of children arrive with baskets of laundry, chattering and splashing in the shallows. One of them points at the jars and asks the brewer if that's the river's breakfast. He replies with a deadpan yes, and if you touch it, the river will eat your breakfast, earning a chorus of giggles. You notice how the jars seem almost camouflaged among the rounded river stones, their earthy tones blending with the bank. The ropes securing them are looped around sturdy stakes hammered into the mud, preventing the current from carrying them off. It's not hard to imagine some long-ago disaster where a jar floated away, leading to frantic chasing and possibly some very tipsy crocodiles downstream. As midday approaches, the breeze picks up, rustling the reeds and carrying the faint smell of wet clay and yeast. The brewer decides it's time to flip the jars so the opposite side gets an even cooling. You help lift one slightly so the river can swirl into the indentation where it rested. The coolness against your fingertips makes you sigh involuntarily. It's like touching a shaded stone after hours in the sun. Once every jar has had its turn, they're lifted back out of the water with grunts and a few muttered phrases that you suspect aren't entirely polite. You help ease yours onto a reed mat so the base doesn't pick up grit. The brewer pats the side of one jar as if to say, "Good work, old friend," before beginning the careful procession back to the village. On the walk back, you pass a fisherman repairing his net. He calls out something about saving him a cup from this batch, and the brewer responds with a laugh and a promise, though you can't tell if it's a real promise or just the polite kind people make when they know the beer will be gone before the fisherman ever shows up. By the time you reach the courtyard again, the jars feel different in your hands, cool, settled, as though the Nile's touch has given them new patience for the days ahead. The brewer arranges them back in their shaded line, adding fresh mud seals to replace any that cracked in transit. You take a step back, wiping sweat from your forehead, and realize that this day wasn't just about cooling beer. It was about watching a community lean on its river like an old friend. The Nile has been part of every stage of this brewing process, from watering the barley fields to cooling the jars, and standing here you can't imagine Nubian beer without it. The brewer catches your eye and gives a slow nod toward the drying racks where tomorrow's barley will need checking. Even in the still heat of the afternoon, the work hums on quietly, always preparing, always in rhythm. And somewhere in the background, the river keeps flowing, as if it knows the next batch will be here soon enough. It's the kind of morning where the air feels just slightly thicker than usual, like the Nile's been breathing slowly all night and now the whole village is inhaling with it. You've been waiting for this day ever since the brewer mentioned it. Tasting day. The sealed jars have been sitting for the perfect stretch of days, cooled by the river, warmed by the afternoons, coaxed into readiness by yeast that you can't see but can certainly smell. You arrive to find the courtyard already buzzing with the subtle kind of excitement that comes before a shared meal, or in this case, a shared drink. The brewer is kneeling by the biggest jar, his hands resting on the mud seal like a doctor listening to a heartbeat. The seal itself is cracked just enough to let the air whisper through, carrying that unmistakable aroma of fermenting grain. When he finally peels it open, the scent drifts out like warm bread meeting sun-dried dates. There's an earthiness to it too, like riverbank soil after a brief rain. You lean in and see a thick, tawny liquid swirling lazily, dotted with soft clusters of grain. This is not the crystal-clear brew you might expect from modern bottles. Nubian beer is alive in the glass, well, clay cup, cloudy, textured, unapologetically itself. The first pour is for the brewer's eldest aunt, who has a look on her face like she invented beer personally. She takes a sip, smacks her lips, and declares, "Better than last year, but not as good as when my father brewed it." You can't tell if this is genuine critique or just a family tradition of keeping brewers humble. Your turn comes next. The cup is heavier than expected, its rough rim warming quickly in your hands. You bring it to your lips and sip carefully. The flavor is surprising, sweetness from the dates, a faint tartness from the fermentation, and a grainy chew that makes you feel like you're drinking liquid bread. There's a gentle fizz that wasn't there a moment ago, almost like the beer is reacting to fresh air and the first touch of daylight. Mainstream historians will tell you Nubian beer was lower in alcohol than many modern brews, more nourishing than intoxicating, and often consumed as part of a meal. But here's a quirk that doesn't make the textbooks. Some villagers swore that if you took the first sip while holding your breath, the beer would stay strong, for longer in your belly. The logic is questionable, but the superstition lives on in small gestures. You notice one of the younger men subtly pause his breathing before tipping his cup. Historians still argue whether such rituals were genuine beliefs or simply playful tradition layered onto everyday life. The brewer passes out more cups, and soon the courtyard becomes a patchwork of voices, laughter, and the clinking of pottery. Children dart around carrying small sips in shallow bowls, giggling at the tickle of bubbles on their tongues. An old man sitting in the shade raises his cup in your direction and mutters something about finally having enough help in this village, before taking a slow, deliberate drink. At one corner, a group of women begin pounding a soft rhythm on inverted baskets, adding a heartbeat to the gathering. The sound blends with the breeze through the palms, with the faint lap of the river just beyond the houses. You get the sense that beer isn't just a drink here. It's a reason for people to come together, to trade news, to resolve small quarrels that have been simmering since market day. Halfway through your cup, you encounter what the brewer called floating protein. It's a chunk of grain, perfectly harmless, though it does make you hesitate for a second. You remind yourself it's part of the experience, and besides, spitting it out would draw way too much attention. You chew it instead, nodding like it was the most natural thing in the world. The conversation turns toward the gods, as it often does in Nubia when beer is involved. Someone swears that last month they saw a heron land on the temple roof right after the first sip of a new brew. A sign, they insist, that the gods were pleased. Another villager counters with a story about a jar breaking during fermentation, which they claim meant the gods had enough beer already. The brewer just smiles and keeps pouring, as if divine opinion is a matter best left to speculation. A boy sidles up next to you, clearly eager to be part of the adult moment. He leans in and whispers, "It's better if you drink while looking at the river. Makes it taste like fish, but in a good way." You take another sip while glancing toward the Nile just to humor him, and you have to admit, something about the play of sunlight on the water does make the flavor feel richer, even if you can't quite pin down why. As the sun climbs, the crowd thins. People wander back to their chores, a little slower than usual, carrying the aftertaste of malt and dates with them. The brewer refits the seal on the largest jar, saving what's left for temple offerings and the workers down at the boatyard. You offer to help carry one of the smaller jars, but he waves you off with a grin. "You've done enough tasting for today," he says, and you realize that tasting is work too, at least in a place where beer is more than just a beverage. By the time you step back into the open street, the village has settled into that post-gathering calm. You pass a child drawing in the dust with a stick, the outline of a jar slowly taking shape. Maybe they're sketching the future's beer supply, or maybe it's just the only shape they've been staring at all morning. Either way, the image feels fitting, the story of today's brew already becoming part of tomorrow's rhythm. The midday sun leans hard on your shoulders as you follow the brewer down a narrow path toward the sandstone temple. He carries the jar with both hands, his back slightly bent, not from age but from the weight of what's inside. It's not just beer, at least not today. It's an offering, a direct line between human hands and divine favor, if the gods happen to be listening. You've seen the temple before, its walls catching the light like a baked loaf. Today, though, the air around it feels charged. There's the distant thump of drums, slow ceremonial beats, and the faint smell of burning resin drifting from within. The beer jar seems heavier now, though you're not the one holding it. Inside the courtyard, priests move deliberately, their linen robes whispering against sandstone floors. One gestures for the brewer to place the jar on a low altar beside a tray of honeycombs and a bowl of pomegranate seeds. The contrast is striking. The soft gleam of fruit, the sticky golden light of honey, and the opaque, earthy weight of the beer. Mainstream historians point out that in Nubia, beer wasn't just for people. It was an essential part of religious life, poured as libations to gods and ancestors alike. Some deities were thought to prefer it sweetened with date syrup, while others were said to favor the pure grain taste. A quirky tidbit? In one Nubian village's oral history, a god allegedly refused an offering by sending a crocodile to knock the jar into the river. That same year, the people doubled the beer's sweetness just in case. Historians still argue whether that tale is symbolic of famine years or an actual crocodile incident retold with a divine twist. The priest dips a carved ladle into the jar, stirring gently, as if waking the spirit of the drink. He pours a thin stream onto the temple floor, the liquid vanishing almost instantly into the thirsty stone. You're told this is for the earth itself, to nourish the ground so it will, in turn, nourish the grain for future brews. A hymn begins somewhere deeper in the temple, voices low and steady. The acoustics are uncanny. Every note seems to linger in the air before folding into the next. You notice the way the priests exchange glances, subtle but meaningful, as if this particular batch of beer carries a message beyond its flavor. One of the younger acolytes sidles up to you and whispers, too loudly, that beer is the only thing the gods drink when they're in a good mood. His superior shoots him a sharp look, but you catch a flicker of a smile before the lad hurries away to tend the incense. You imagine an entire pantheon lounging somewhere in the clouds, sipping cloudy beer from painted cups, commenting on the mortal's brewing skills. After the offering, the brewer is invited to take a seat under the shade of a column, a rare honor. He accepts, sipping a cup poured from the same jar, proof that whatever is good enough for the gods is also good enough for their human intermediaries. You're handed a cup too, and drinking it here, surrounded by carved reliefs of ancient battles and harvest scenes. The beer tastes different. It's not sweeter, not stronger, just heavier somehow, like the walls are holding centuries of offerings, and each sip connects you to every one of them. A pair of women arrive with baskets of flatbread, laying them beside the altar. One explains softly that the bread and beer together form a complete gift, grain transformed in two ways, solid and liquid. You think about the farmers you saw harvesting in the fields, about the grinding stones, the fermenting jars, the quiet patience that goes into every batch. This cup isn't just a drink. It's the final step in a chain of work that began under a searing sun weeks ago. Before you leave, the high priest places a hand on the jar and murmurs a blessing, not just for the gods to receive the beer, but for the next harvest to be plentiful, the next brew to be strong, and the river to keep running clear. He doesn't say anything about crocodiles, but you figure that's implied. As you and the brewer step back into the blinding daylight, the path home seems softer, less crowded by noise. You pass the honeycombs again, the pomegranates, the smell of resin still clinging to your hair. You realize the offering isn't the end of the beer's journey. It's more like a loop, feeding into the cycle that will bring you back here again next season, jar in hand, ready to try to please the gods all over again. The next morning, the village feels like it's still humming from yesterday's temple visit. The brewer is already at work before the sun peaks over the eastern ridge, checking jars in his shaded storage hut. You step inside and are hit by that familiar, slightly sour, slightly sweet scent of fermenting grain. In the dim light, rows of jars lean against the mud brick wall like soldiers standing at ease. He lifts a lid from one vessel, peers inside, and nods, content with the gentle bubbles forming along the edges. You can hear them faintly, a quiet, popping whisper, like the beer is breathing. Mainstream historians note that in ancient Nubia, beer could ferment anywhere from a single day to several, depending on the season. A hotter day meant a faster ferment, which could lead to more tang but also more unpredictability. The quirky tidbit? One old Nubian rhyme warned, "Rush your beer and the gods will drink it first," meaning the batch might spoil before you got to enjoy it. Historians still argue whether that's just poetic advice or evidence of actual spoilage superstition. The brewer moves slowly between jars, tapping some lightly, giving others a swirl to judge their readiness. You follow his lead, though your swirling is probably more for show. He laughs quietly and tells you not to overdo it. You wouldn't want to wake it up too much. Beer here is a living thing in more than just the biological sense. It's part of the household, part of the rhythm of life. From outside, you hear the slap of wet clay being worked. A potter is shaping new beer jars, his hands moving in that hypnotic spiral motion, coaxing the form upward from a lump of earth. You wander out to watch him, the brewer trailing behind. His work is fluid, each turn of the wheel smoothing the jar's skin. He says that beer jars have to breathe, meaning their clay walls should be just porous enough to allow a touch of air exchange. Too tight, and the beer could taste flat. Too open, and it might sour too quickly. As the wheel spins, the potter jokes about how beer jars are like people. Some tall and elegant, others stout and practical, but all with their own purpose. He winks and tells you the gods, if they're in a playful mood, might choose their favorite jar shape when deciding which village to bless with good harvests. You can't tell if he's serious, but given yesterday's crocodile story, you're not ruling anything out. Back in the storage hut, the brewer starts siphoning beer from a nearly finished jar into smaller clay cups. A few neighbors arrive, each carrying their own vessel, some practical and plain, others painted with geometric designs. The mood is casual, like a morning coffee run, except your coffee is cloudy and smells faintly of fresh bread left in the sun. As they drink, conversation drifts from fishing conditions to how quickly the last floodwater receded. Someone mentions that a rival village claims their beer stays fresh twice as long because they store it underground. The brewer rolls his eyes and mutters about people hiding beer from the sun and calling it innovation. Still, you note the glimmer of curiosity in his expression. Historians still argue whether subterranean storage was widely practiced in Nubia or just a rare local experiment. One neighbor hands you their cup, urging you to try. The taste is lively, slightly tart, with a soft grain sweetness underneath. You notice how everyone takes small sips, not gulps, letting the drink linger. Beer here isn't something to hurry through. It's part of the conversation itself, a slow companion to the day's unfolding. After the morning's cups are drained, the brewer seals the remaining jars with thick clay stoppers, smoothing the surface with wet fingers. He tells you each jar is marked with a small thumbprint, his own personal seal. In a market far away, someone might break that seal and know instantly where the beer came from. You imagine a future historian finding one of those lids in the sand, turning it over in their palm, and debating whether the thumbprint was practical branding or a quiet act of pride. As the sun climbs higher, the brewer sits down on the storage hut step, squinting at the line of date palms by the river. He says they'll start another batch soon, maybe with a handful of dates crushed into the grain for a sweeter festival brew. You can almost taste it already, like the river breeze mixed with baked fruit. He hands you a final cup, warm from sitting in the shade but untouched by the heat. You take a sip, and it's as if yesterday's temple offering, today's morning laughter, and the future harvest all exist together in that one moment. The beer is still breathing, and so is the village around you. The afternoon settles in with that languid heaviness the Nile seems to encourage. Everything moving slower, sounds stretching into the warm air. You walk with the brewer toward the riverbank, where the water curls lazily around patches of reeds. He says you're going to meet the fishers who supply more than just fish to the village. Their boats are simple reed craft, low to the water, and smell faintly of sun-dried papyrus. One fisher, a wiry woman with arms as strong as rope, holds up a bulging net. Inside, silver flashes of fish, yes, but also clumps of green algae and bundles of river plants. You raise an eyebrow and she grins, explaining that some of this river grass will end up as part of the beer-making process. Mainstream historians will tell you that certain aquatic plants were used in ancient Nubia to flavor or clarify beer. The quirky tidbit? In some oral traditions, there's a belief that the Nile's plants carry whispers from the gods, and beer brewed with them makes you hear more clearly in your dreams. Historians still argue whether that phrase is poetic metaphor or genuine evidence of dream-focused ritual drinking. The brewer inspects the hull, setting aside a small bundle of fragrant stems. They have a crisp, cucumber-like scent when you crush them between your fingers. He explains they might drop these into a cooling vat of beer just before fermentation for a gentle flavor twist. You try to imagine modern beer marketing making that sound appealing, now with added Nile plant for whisper-enhanced dreams. But here, it feels perfectly natural. The fishers tease the brewer about bringing enough beer for the trade, but he waves them off and promises payment in a fresh jar tomorrow. The barter here isn't rigid. It flows like the river, with trust built over seasons rather than contracts. You wander to the edge of the water, where your toes sink into soft mud. Tiny crabs scuttle sideways, and the surface ripples with darting minnows. The fisherwoman tells you the river has its own moods, some days generous, some days stingy. She compares it to beer. You follow the process, but the result still depends on forces outside your control. Back at the brewer's hut, you help rinse the plants in a wide ceramic basin. The cool water running over your hands is a small relief from the sun. He talks about experimenting with proportions, how too much plant matter can overpower the malt flavor, while too little won't be noticed at all. You realize brewing here is a balance of patience, intuition, and gentle nudging rather than strict recipes. A neighbor drops by with a small basket of figs. She says therefore, the evening's brew snack, but the brewer hints one or two might find their way into a special jar for his personal stash. The figs are soft, almost melting in your fingers, and you can imagine their syrupy sweetness blending with the beer's grainy base. While you work, the brewer tells you a half-serious tale about a long-gone Nubian king who supposedly commanded an entire river bend to be diverted so he could have a private brewing pond. You point out that this sounds a bit extravagant. He shrugs and says, "Kings drink differently." Historians still argue whether that story is exaggerated, but archaeological remains of curious water channels near old settlements keep the debate alive. As the sun begins to lower, you and the brewer carry the rinsed plants to the storage hut, adding a few stems to a jar that's midway through fermentation. The scent changes instantly, a green, fresh note weaving through the warm, yeasty air. He taps the jar's rim gently, as if introducing the new ingredient to the rest of the brew. Outside, the village seems to glow in the honey light of late afternoon. Children chase each other between the date palms, their laughter carrying over the fields. Someone is baking bread in a clay oven, and the scent rolls in thick, mingling with the brewing aromas. You think about how every part of this place, the river, the fields, the people, finds its way into the beer in some form. The brewer leans against the hut's doorway, arms folded, watching the river in the distance. He says tomorrow they'll taste the plant-infused batch to see if it's worth keeping as part of the regular process. You sense he already knows the answer but enjoys pretending it's still uncertain, like a fisherman who claims not to know what's in his net until the last moment. You take one last look at the jars in their quiet corner, each one a small, living experiment. Somewhere in there, the Nile's whispers are curling into the beer, waiting for the night when dreams might carry them further. Night folds over the village in layers, starting with the purple fade along the horizon, then the deepening blue overhead where the first stars blink awake. The air cools just enough for people to step outside again, and the village square begins to hum with low, easy chatter. You follow the brewer, who carries 2 clay jars tucked against his hip like a musician with precious drums. Tonight is for sharing. He tells you this batch is from 3 days ago, already fermented enough for flavor but still young enough to taste lively. The Nubians have a knack for balancing these moments. Too soon and it's flat, too late and it's heavy, but right now it's a sip of the season itself. In the square, a small fire crackles in the center, its light bouncing off the faces of elders and children alike. You sit cross-legged on woven mats, the smell of roasting lentils drifting in from one side. Someone's pounding a soft rhythm on a frame drum, more heartbeat than song. It's the kind of background sound that lets conversations wander without pressure. The brewer pours the beer into shallow, wide cups. It's cloudy, golden brown, and smells of grain warmed in the sun, with that faint green hint from the Nile plants you rinsed earlier. You take a sip, smooth, slightly tart, with a texture almost like oatmeal thin just right. The villagers nod approvingly. Apparently, you've passed some unspoken initiation. Mainstream history notes that Nubian beer was often consumed in communal gatherings, its lower alcohol content making it as much a food staple as a drink. The quirky tidbit here? Some say certain brews were moon-tuned, meaning the fermentation was timed to start or finish under a specific moon phase. Historians still argue whether this was practical, for cooler nights, or mystical, for lunar blessings. The conversation ebbs and flows around you. Talk of crops, of a neighbor's new baby, of a trader who brought odd spices from far upstream. Every so often, someone raises a cup toward the brewer in thanks, and he deflects it with a shrug, like it's the river doing the real work. You notice a cluster of young men near the edge of the square, laughing as they challenge each other to recite a tongue twister in the local dialect without spilling their beer. Most fail halfway through, sputtering into their cups. You think it's the kind of game that would go viral today if anyone could bottle the charm along with the brew. The brewer leans over to tell you a story about a traveling musician who once traded a song for a lifetime supply of beer. The twist? The song was supposedly cursed. Anyone who sang it wrong would lose their voice for a month. He grins and says he's never risked singing it himself. Historians still argue whether such curse trades were serious bargains or just good party entertainment. As the fire burns lower, a few elders begin telling tales. The words roll slow and deep, like the river at night. Some stories are historical, others purely fanciful. You're never entirely sure which is which. The beer passes hand to hand, and the warmth it brings feels less like intoxication and more like a soft weight settling into your bones. You glance upward, catching the silver spill of the Milky Way cutting across the sky. Somewhere behind you, a dog yawns, the sound oddly synchronized with the drumbeat. You can't help but think that in moments like this, Beer is less a beverage and more a binding thread, linking people to each other, to the land, and to the long line of ancestors who drank under these same stars. The brewer hands you the last cup from the jar, a small portion left so you can savor it slowly. The flavor lingers on your tongue, earthy and alive, like it's still carrying fragments of the day's sun. Around you, voices soften, the fire sighs into embers, and the rhythm of the drum fades into the kind of quiet that's almost louder than noise. When you finally stand, the square feels like it's breathing along with you. An inhale of cool river air, an exhale of grainy, yeast-warmed comfort. You follow the brewer home, the empty jars clinking gently at his side, knowing tomorrow's batch is already waiting in the dark to join another night like this. By the time the first blush of dawn touches the horizon, the village is still, except for the low murmurs of the Nile and the occasional rustle of palm leaves overhead. You wake to the smell of damp earth and faint yeast in the air, the byproduct of clay jars breathing through the night. Somewhere nearby, a rooster delivers his opinion of the morning a little too enthusiastically. The brewer is already awake, squatting by the side of his hut, inspecting the jars from yesterday's batch. The lids, woven reeds pressed snugly over the openings, are beaded with tiny droplets. He tips one jar slightly, listening to the muffled fizz inside like a doctor with a stethoscope. Still talking, he murmurs, and you can't help but smile at the idea that each batch has its own personality. In Nubian tradition, brewing isn't just a single event. It's a rolling cycle. One batch is fermenting while another is being consumed, and another is already in the soaking stage. It's a rhythm as steady as the river, and you realize that even without writing, this culture keeps time in hops, or rather, in sorghum and emmer. You help carry a pair of smaller jars to a neighbor's house. She greets you with a piece of flatbread still warm from the hearth, and a cup of last week's beer. "Breakfast," she says with a wink, as if you've been officially drafted into village life. The beer is cooler in the morning, a little sharper on the tongue, pairing strangely well with the bread's nutty sweetness. Mainstream accounts of ancient Nubian diets point out that beer wasn't just leisure, it was nourishment, rich in calories, vitamins from the yeast, and minerals from the river water. The quirky fact? Archaeologists have found residue suggesting some jars were spiced with desert herbs, possibly for medicinal purposes or just to shake up the flavor when the daily brew became too routine. Historians still argue whether those herbs actually had any medicinal benefit, or if they were the ancient equivalent of adding cinnamon to your latte for fun. Later, you walk down to the shore, where a group of children are playing a game that involves tossing reed hoops over sticks planted in the sand. They're chanting something that, once translated, turns out to be a playful rhyme about beer jars being fussy if you feed them after moonrise. You make a mental note that this might be the earliest brewing superstition you've ever heard. By midday, the brewer is preparing to trade some of his beer for a sack of dried dates from a traveling merchant. You watch the exchange. No coin changes hands, just goods for goods, each sealed with a nod. The merchant tastes the beer, closes his eyes for a moment, then grins. Deals like this have likely been happening on this riverbank for thousands of years, with no ledger but memory. As the sun begins to drop again, the brewer invites you to the water's edge one last time. You kneel beside him, the Nile lapping lazily against the shore. He fills a cup from the freshest jar, offering it to you like a final toast. The taste is bright, lively, a little less settled than last night's. Like the river itself, constantly moving, never quite the same from one moment to the next. You take a slow sip, feeling the day's warmth fade from your skin. The sound of the river and the distant chatter from the village blending into something steady, almost like a lullaby. It's in this moment you understand that Nubian beer isn't just about brewing. It's about continuity, a drinkable memory of the place, the people, and the river that has shaped every drop. The last light slips over the horizon now, the edges of the world softening into shadows and muted gold. The village quiets in layers, like a song drawing to a close, each verse fading until only the hum of the river remains. Your cup is warm in your hands, the liquid inside barely moving, though you can still feel the ghost of the day's sun held within it. You lean back, letting your gaze drift upward to the faint stars pricking the velvet sky. In the distance, a single drumbeat marks the time. Not a performance, just a heartbeat for the night to follow. The air is cooler now, carrying the scent of wet reeds and the faint sweetness of fermenting grain from the jars tucked away in the brewer's hut. You can feel the stillness settle over your shoulders like a blanket, the kind that doesn't just keep you warm but anchors you to the moment. The voices from earlier are gone now, replaced by the low rustle of palm fronds and the slow, rhythmic lap of water against the shore. It's a sound without urgency, a sound that could go on forever. You close your eyes, and the darkness behind them feels no different from the one gathering around the village. Your breathing falls into sync with the river, steady, unhurried. Somewhere, the brewer is already dreaming of tomorrow's batch, the cycle continuing as it always has. And here you are, rooted in this moment, with the taste of the Nile and the grain still lingering, with the hum of the ancient night folding softly around you.